My marriage with my son's father was a complete disaster. I believe that the universe was mocking me for any attempt to fill that father shaped void and to rework the worst parts of prior relationships. My relationship with the first Englishman, most notably. In hindsight, it was as if I was choosing all the toxic traits of my former relationships, hoping to correct them within the body of the one body of my ex husband. In doing so, I would be fixing whatever broke inside me when those former relationships ended. I would be possessed of a certain type of ego to assume that I did not carry some burden of responsibility for some of the toxicity in those previous relationships as well. But I always thought that the point of being in intimate relation with someone was to push each other to grow and become our best selves, not to enable and encourage whatever habits keeps one stagnant and codependent on the other. To be fair, if I were to assess the common denominator in each of my failed relationships, besides myself, of course, it would be addictions. Every toxic trait known to man showed up within that one physical psychopathic vessel of an ex husband. Maybe it was my own rampant narcissism, not his, in this egregiously gross choice. If I could heal this reprobate with love, I would be proving that I too was worth loving, healing that deep seed of insufficient self worth inside me. If I could fix this monster, I could fix the monster in me, the one shunned by the world and declared somehow irredeemable, so rejected I felt at my core. Maybe it was not narcissism at all. Maybe it was benevolent, unconditional love for humanity that caused me to martyr myself to this man. For I remember remarking to him when we were with child that our love would heal generational trauma, that of master slave, oppressor oppressed, perpetrator victim. Maybe it was a combination of all these things. In the end, if I was worthy of him being fixed for, he would find it unnecessary to break me with his toxic existence, his very beingness, and we could, together, heal the world in one gasping orgasmic kumbaya. I have often heard that addictions come in threes. Sex, gambling, and drugs are the most prevalent in our society and appear in nearly every one of my relationships. At least one of these. My ex husband indulged in these unholy three and various others without remorse. His pernicious thievery as a means to procure for him what charm and manipulation failed to accomplish meant that kleptomania was thrown into the addiction pool as well. What was most diabolical was that each one would be used to leverage the other, all for selfish gain. It was not as benign as my half of the chocolate bar, the last of the ice cream, nor even, in his case, driving my car until it was empty of gas, only to return it for me to refill, but with his pockets bulging with scratch cards and a half a gram or so of cocaine. These last he would present to me, eyes dilated and eager to share his spoils, usually in penance to whatever bad behavior or real responsibility he shirked in lieu of getting high. His behavior was fiendish. Anything to get a high, to get a hit and or validation. In my loneliness, desperation, and prideful inability to admit the grave, very near literal mistake I made in my choice of partner, I would indulge in a line, a scratch or two of an obvious bad gamble, all while dolling a lecture on the abuse of money in this way, even while knowing the hypocrisy trap was one of his manipulation tactics. I would tread carefully around him and substances, not wanting to enable his avid addictions, nor the codependent loop he worked so hard to create to entrap me. All this meant was that he would come home less and less. So I would encourage his use at home, and would partake just enough to make it evident that I could have done without, and use that time together to make suggestions as to what better uses the money could be used for. My father would have objected to this man on all levels. My father's locus of control was he was devoid of addictions and devout to the Bible, which made it hard to hold him accountable to any blemishes to his personage. He was biblically correct, and was ever ready with a Bible verse to prove it. Any unfortunate occurrence in his life was therefore, in God's will, as the impenetrable head of household, he would wield the word of God at us in order to vanquish whatever evil spirit possessed us to disobey his word. I would later learn through most of my relationships that demanding submission to his word was the best way of controlling his house teeming with daughters. We met on his honeymoon in Bali. He and his ex-fiance had called off the wedding the day before their ceremony, and they both agreed they would be civil and still take their honeymoon in Bali only she would be bringing her new boyfriend with my ex-husband as the third wheel. It made it sound like it was amicable, but it felt more like an act of hostility, as neither were willing to rearrange or rework the honeymoon in respect of the other. That should have been the most obvious of red flags, except that I too have ended relationships on good enough terms where I spent time with my exes and their new partners. I did not know that she was kept around as the scapegoat for all his transgressions, only to leap to the next relationship to absorb his inequities, blaming his shortcomings first on his old relationships and then on his current partner. She was a slew of nasty expletives when he and I first started dating, and he was happy to be done with her. Then she became a third part in our relationship, and then in the end, I lacked in comparison to her, and I was the long list of terribly unclever names I will not repeat here. Then he was off to the next relationship. Like a monkey swinging from tree to tree, throwing feces, hiding hands, or pointing fingers. When we met, I was doing marketing for a small resort in a remote area on the West Coast. In some lusty loneliness, I downloaded a dating app and chose a guy with half a face as a profile picture. I do not know why I chose so arbitrarily. Maybe to prove that it was all arbitrary. Swipe left, swipe right, vote right, blah blah. Bodies want what bodies can do, and I wanted to do it to whomever had a body and was willing to bring it next to mine, so I felt less alone. I reckon I was also trying to prove that it was not only about looks, but was somehow trying to read between the lines and into a person's character by choosing someone who had an indiscernible face, as his profile was possessed of only a few photos, all outlining a silhouette in a variety of neutral pastoral scenes and no real grasp of a true face. So distant were the photos taken. Whatever the reason, I firmly believe my choice in a partner was predetermined, and that there was no choice in the matter. Our conversations were long but lackluster, made more interesting by my poking fun at his poor syntax and spelling. I have little recollection of the actual content of the conversations. Nerdy flirtation with cheesy suggestive overtones, as is my usual formula for continuous long distance engagement. I knew that he was available and willing to talk if I was at that point. After a debilitating Bintang beer hangover rendered me incapacitated and unable to make it out of bed, I invited him to make the 2-hour drive to the resort to buy me bakso, a local soup. He came. Our rendezvous point was a typical Indonesian night market. He arrived on the back of a motorbike, late, red-faced, nose-peeling with sunburn and sheepishly apologetic. He was soft-spoken and shy, tall and wiry, but not overly muscular. Bland hair that was not entirely blonde, not entirely brown, and boyish looks that were attractive, but not disarmingly so. He looked, well, normal. I badly wanted him to be normal, to balance my imbalance, my subversive existence, knowing self-critically that I myself am a creature haunted with a certain chaos. The first indication of his psychopathy occurred on the first night after the expulsion of his passionate seed inside me, despite my warning that I was not on any birth control. When I reminded him of that fact afterward, he simply said that if I was pregnant, he would move to Bali and raise the baby with me. He had a knack for covering his glaring disrespect with charming irrationalities bordering on the absurd. Of course, I should have used protection and waited for marriage, like any self-respecting young woman, and like my father would have wanted. But I had just emerged from the cocoon of many months of celibacy, was and feeling alluring in my tan slimness. And lest we forget, I was still grieving the loss of the most important man in my life. Sexual healing is a very, very real thing. As I said, I used every method of healing I could think of, hoping to reconcile myself with the grief of the loss of my father. There is no perverse connection with the loss of my father, only a man-shaped hole in my life needing to be filled metaphorically and symbolically. This overgrown man-child before me, coincidentally, was also a carpenter and electrician, among many other things cleverly disguised. 3 days turned into a week, which turned into 2 weeks before his return flight to England. Cornwall, to be exact, the land of pirates, Viking descent, ruthless bandits and thieves, I would come to understand them as. Those days together were immaculate and postcard perfect. Long walks on the beach, cold beers in the warm evening breeze, nights of passion lasting through to the morning, afternoon delights and meals in bed. I blame it on Bali. We met in an ideal honeymoon destination, and we treated it as such. I believed him when he said he loved me, even using my orphan stories of child trauma against me. The delusion of this love would have been a perfect cover for my unwillingness to do the work to mourn my father properly if he had been a bit more pious in his efforts to subdue my wild spirit with his words and actions. In the end, I avoided my own peaceful healing by way of my anger and his audacity in thinking that it was within his power to subdue me so, or in his arrogant attempt to do so. Any disagreements with him would turn into accusations and gaslighting. But instead of having the Bible to lean on, he would create a deliberately self motivated misunderstanding, warring his object impermanence against my desperate need to apply logic like a soothing salve the situation. He would attribute spiteful intentions to my innocuous actions or words. I had never been exposed to this form of gaslighting before. Lying to me about me was such an odd and eerie thing to endure, causing me to question my own experiences until I was so overwhelmed and confused that I just let the argument go. It would be over the most banal topics and disagreements, mostly regarding division of labor, which I took on more and more until I was very sure that I did not need him and could find nothing in him that I desired either. He was withholding of love and affection almost out of boredom. He would cause a fight that I would then attempt to correct for the sake of general peace and harmony. He would use any attempts at appeasement as a moment of weakness and a window to introduce drugs and alcohol. Our home routine needed the dopamine hits of arguments, followed by drug and alcohol induced reconciliation. Throwing tantrums turned to throwing things, physical threats of violence, vile name calling, and death threats, and actual physical violence. He stole money, lots of it. He stole prescription medication and alcohol from myself and friends. He stole clothes, jewelry, electronics. It was weird and gross, and what I thought in the earliest days was out of character. My cognitive dissonance was so great. I would soon find out that it was right in line with his character. Shit! It was more his character than the rare instances of raw honesty and sincere intimacy. He was a malicious thief, not a noble thief with honor or purpose other than self service. It was exhausting. I lost weight. I lost myself. I kept cleaning up his messes to the point where he would just outright blame things on me, or tell a story so sordidly enmeshed that we were both implicated in his poor choices and delinquent behavior. So muddied the waters would become. I worked tirelessly to right wrongs, lest my own reputation and character be called into question. Conversely, at times, in social occasions, he would regale eager listeners of our adventures and confusingly boast about me. I realized this served two purposes. One, to confuse me and make me feel that he must really and truly love me to be so openly proud to have me by his side. The second was to elicit awe and competition from other women playing on their insecurities, after which they would feel all the more special when he expressed interest in betting them. Dizzying cycles of weaponized incompetence and weaponized compliments. Triangulation. More gaslighting, more manipulations, more smoke and mirrors. But this too was a pirate's ploy. Pussy pirate that he was. All the more sordid was his choice in mistress. Tiny and blondes, a lot of them. I do not say this with disdain, just in acute observation and in juxtaposition, rather than in opposition to myself. What was the actual point of marrying a tall, normal bodied black woman if the desire was to sleep with every porridge faced pygmy blonde in town, since they were not particularly good looking, only crowned appropriately? His infidelity had a cycle of abuse, as well, in which he would return home from a night or two away, immediately shower and treat me with distance, irritability, and disdain, all in shame of what he had done. I did not need to be suspicious because my intuition. And eventually, at the end, a quick rifle through his phone told me everything. I would beg him to return to our love, telling him simply, "Come back to me." And he would for a time. He seemed to snap out of his treacherous trance, becoming my doting and fun loving husband once more. A trusted male mentor said that his Britishness would not let him fully commit to the love he felt for me. So he felt like he owed it to his programming to cheat with white blonde women, which were more palatable to his family and cultural conditioning. I saw this too with his treatment of me. It was as if he couldn't help himself from the lies and manipulation. akin to the tactics of British colonization, colonizing my black body aggressively with demeaning sexual acts, vicious name-calling, and threats of crippling violence, drugging me, and eventually threats of death, going so far as to threaten not only my life, but eventually the life of the child growing inside me. This relationship represents a failure in all aspects of self and is a failure that I am faced with daily in my evolving relationship with my son and the Sisyphean task of single parenthood. In contrast, the die-hard romanticism and notion of forever that I spoke of with the first Englishman still exists here within the relentless struggle of raising a child alone with limitless unconditional love. I battle the resentment that would breed my own parental narcissism and lean instead into the delusion of the love I once felt for my son's father. Love, whose shiny veneer has been dulled, faded and corroded with the truth of the nature of his very character and the situation at large. All that glitters is not gold. And yet, in leaning hard into my role as a parent, I find that one can polish a turd with unconditional love. And after a time, alchemize something tragic into something triumphant and beautiful. I give a lot of respect to my parents for their ability to weather many marriage storms. I was not aware of how much toxic behavior was normalized in the household and which became internalized in my psyche. My dad would often say that if not for God, he would have left my mother if not for her various illnesses, or he would threaten to leave her because of illness, depending on the day. This was a message to my mom to feel gratitude for his continued love and support. It also sent a particular message to us children. Us girls, especially, had a lot of radically misattunements and negative core beliefs instilled in us. My father's hope was to keep the Pandora's box of hormones closed and our legs by Tegs telling us that guys only want you for one reason. This, paired with my mom's forced subordination, was a recipe for an abusive relationship. My full disclosure of these events to my husband when we were just dating only gave him ammunition for his manipulation. When I began to question his many abusive behaviors and would tell him I needed to speak to my therapist about some of the things that were happening between us, he would take a play from my father's playbook stating, "Who is going to believe you with your mom being crazy? I will just tell everyone you are crazy." It was so quick off his tongue. It was as if it was not only rehearsed, but premeditated when choosing me as his choice and partner. He would use these same tactics to draw in his future affairs. Using any reasonable boundaries, I would set as an excuse to step out of our relationship and overinflate any part one had in arguments in order to paint me out to be crazy, validated by my mom's mental health diagnosis. He was so desperate for both male and female validation that stemmed from mother and father wounds. I could hear his penis crying for him, representing his severely arrested, wounded inner child, unsure of how to perform as an adult, parent, partner, or even a basic person. He was something else, a barrage of toxic coping skills, manipulation and lies, and tattered core beliefs. To me, he was unrecognizable as a whole human. But I understood that to a degree, feeling that I too was some sort of pseudo self clawing my way to coherency. I differed with my husband only in my methods. It is excruciatingly hard to write about my marriage in a way that does not sound like one of the police reports filed both in the US and England, listing in full his acts of interpersonal terrorism. I am trying to fill in the gaps between abuses with a meaningful narrative and backstory, and in relation to my father, without gaslighting myself into misremembering the atrocities simply for the sake of romanticizing the reader with pretty pretentious rhetoric. Actually, I will not split hairs here. To put it ineloquently, he was and still is a colossal primordial prick. A bad human, and even worse father for his inability and unwillingness to curb any of his negative behaviors in favor of a more healed and hopeful progenital future. Almost pitiably, the truth is that he did not stand a chance. His epigenetic material was cursed on both sides, and I think he realized early on that it would be an uphill battle, and so gave up long before he could say that he even tried and failed. Easy logic. You cannot fail if you never try. His mother is a somatic narcissist, keeping herself slim by going on endless singles holiday hikes to distant lands with mostly British bachelors. She would return to boast about her full dance card and the grossly inappropriate words or gestures made toward her by the males in her group. Improprieties that would easily get these men slapped or excommunicated from the group, but which she entertained with giggles and witty retorts, breadcrumbing their blue balls into buying her dinners or endless rounds of drinks, only to diss and dismiss them upon the return home. Far be it from me to knock another's hustle, and I know this is the routine of many women and men on the dating circuit, but my tolerance for her was only moderately higher than my respect, especially in hearing of how and why she coupled with my ex husband's ex stepdad. As his ex stepdad relays the story, him being a trustworthy testimony and witness to the family's history of abuses of all types, my ex husband's biological father was also an addict, gambler, and womanizer. Married to his mother, and with a 2-year-old son already, he returned home on a bender and raped his wife. According to the story, when she told him she was with child, he beat her and left, never to be seen nor heard from again. That baby in the belly was my ex husband. Now, a bit of easy psychology, or even common sense, would steer a person away from, or at least make obvious, these same toxic intergenerational patterns in order to keep them from repeating in one's own life. But with narcissists, the shame can be so acute that they double down on the toxicity, contorting events so much so that the victim is seen as the perpetrator, even in their own eyes. His mother, now left with 2 children and a great deal of self pity and self righteous indignation, set out to make a male Ormony pay for the mistakes of the one. She set her sights on my ex's stepdad when my ex was just a baby, working her wiles and reciting a story of woe and wrongly done by. If his dad was as kind and gentle then as he is now, I believe he was taken in by her story and situation just as much as he was taken in by her overly sexualized stratagems. He is, after all, just a man. She stayed married to him long enough to convince him to raise the boys to a sort of masculine independence in their preteens, after which she divorced him and took half of everything he owned. She would encourage the boys to see their father for financial help and would periodically kick them out of the house, sending them to their stepdads so that she could more candidly and clandestinely court new men within their home, the home that had once belonged to their stepdad. My ex husband seemed to not be privy to the information of the rape, only of the beating, and it was not my place to insist upon the truth that was told to me in confidence of the old man and father figure to him. It was only my business in that the truth set me free from thinking that I could somehow save this person from himself. At this point, he had our ancestors to contend with. I will say this. He had a vehement disgust for his mother, which only fully surfaced when he would drunkenly recount how often she displaced him from their house in lieu of one of her suitors. The rancor in his eyes and bite with which he spoke of her gave me the distinct feeling that he somehow sympathized with his biological father, as if he understood why he had resorted to physical violence against her. It was with those same eyes he would look at me during his bouts of violence toward me, possessed genetically with the inherited energetic material of his father, and in confusion of time, place, and people. I could, at times, coax him down from his confusion and insist that I was not his mother, and instead encourage him to write about his anger toward both of his parents in a letter, after which we could ritualistically burn it. He refused, opting for the visceral and real experience of deflection and projection, needing a real body on which to enact his rage. My body, and then repeated historical horror, the body of my son in vitro. I still cannot fathom what compelling compatible traumas we share to these deeply wounded depths. It goes beyond the superficial empath narcissist relationship. There is something here that is mathematically incorrect. It is the perpetually archaic war of light versus dark, originating from core concepts and radiating outward, consuming all that we hold sacred in its attempt to find balance, if not harmony, for better or worse. It is the darkness within which we have yet to contend that infects us with a zombie likeness to spread our dark disease. It had just never been so literal for me before. That being said, my son is my hero, balanced precariously on the unstable pillar of single parenthood. I believe I would have stayed with this bulldozing monster and let him continue to uproot me body and soul. I tried desperately to make it up to Wrigley for his father's misdeeds, including trying to make this man a father to him. After a year of separation and the start of divorce proceedings, I made the foolish decision to give away all of our belongings and move to England with the promise that he was doing the healing work through therapy and sobriety. It was not so much the sobriety that I objected to, even though that was an excessive distraction to more self revealing pastimes. It was the escapism at all cost. Although, like my father, he was adept at many hobbies and crafts, he was mappied hospi boasting about them instead of engaging in them, even with full support. There is no adequate thing that I, as a black woman, could give to this British white man, whose woeful whining was rooted in his unrelatability to me, and not the other way around. My existence was out of the convenient knowledge that someone was committed to understanding him, but with no reciprocity or effort on his part. I wanted so badly to believe that he had been exorcised of his demons, and was ready to be the man I thought he was when I married him. The man I met on the internet said with absurdity and sarcasm, I naively believe that if you can conceive it, you can achieve it. I wanted his mask to eat into his face, and for him to be all that he promised he could and would be, all that he pretended to be to the outside world. Hell, I was willing to settle for a fake it until you make it scenario. I did not want to raise a child alone. I had not wanted to have a child at all, but had wanted to satisfy his desire to prove he was not like his biological father, which ironically was his exact reasoning for wanting to have a male child specifically. It took only a few days of diligence and doting before he arrived at home, eyes recognizably wide, announcing that a friend had gifted him a gram to celebrate our reunion. The friend turned out to be his boss at the construction site, and the gift turned out to be how he was getting paid on the job, which came in ounces and not grams, and which he sold in the party town nearby, a beach community of surf bums and ne'er-do-wells. Common sense told me to leave with the arrival of the first gift and a 6 a.m. bedtime and hard hangover. I was aghast and ashamed to have trusted and allowed myself to be isolated and illegally living in a country and feeling forced to comply with this man's toxicity. I had sacrificed too much to get there, only to be proven once more a fool, this time without any rights and no loyal local support system of any kind. I resigned myself to the fuck up and instead adopted a morbid and well documented curiosity of his treatment of me. I was applying my own situation to lend validity to the research I had begun on personality types during our separation, trying desperately to figure out what was wrong with him for treating me that way, and what was wrong with me for allowing these behaviors. What were these compatible traumas that bonded us so toxically? I began to program the machine and deflect his programming armed with psychoeducation, and began carefully collecting damning evidence of his true character. Evidence that would unmuddy the waters he was intent on drowning me in, even if that evidence was only for my own peace of mind. In a way, I was playing him at his own game. He had no intention of being a husband. He wanted me isolated, illegal, and under his thumb, so he could continue the abuse and neglect without having to pay for it. No divorce meant no child support, especially since I was self-supported. Cheaper to keep her. My ex-husband had this knack for treating everyone as dumb as he needed them to be for him to manipulate them. Horrifically, I have seen clever people, including myself, play to that level of stupidity due to the great chasm between reality and cognitive dissonance. But I also knew that in order to get the intel and evidence needed in circumstances, sometimes you need to play the fool to fool the fool that thinks they are fooling you. It is for this reason I once again stayed too long. When I made it clear that I would once again be leaving him, he nearly choked on how hard he went about trying to hoover me back up. Then came the roofies. He began drugging me with ketamine in my gin and wine so that I became more compliant. The wine he roofied when I was especially drunk, so I did not fully notice the bitter taste. Sometimes, when I was receptive enough to the situation, he would mix it with cocaine and then eventually only give me ketamine as he took his line of uncut cocaine. It bothered me only in that it was deception, but neither drug I was particularly attached to, nor their effects. Curious if I could both hold space for this criminal and at the same time hold him accountable to his horrendous deeds. I confronted him asking if he was drugging me, to which he denied, even though the physical effects on my person were obvious to me. This made me all the more angry with the level of stupid he believed I was. He spent these drug-laden evenings retelling our stories with slight changes that highlighted him as a hero or doting husband and father. I used those instances for my own self-psychoanalysis and exploration. I was flirting dangerously with consciousness expansion and consciousness escapism, but anchored firmly to my role as primary parent and caretaker for my child. I was also secure in the knowledge that the more I stayed awake and in control, the more clear headed I would be in gathering evidence to support any eventual custody disputes that may occur in the future. He had become so comfortable with my obliging observation and non resistance that he came to believe that his brainwashing was complete. After 6 months of increased drug use and abuse of me, there was a very necessary break in my psyche and situation. He came home one night on the anniversary of our meeting in mid December, arrogant on a cocaine high, and stated that he had found a hitman on the dark web to kill me at a cost far less than what he owed in tentative child support, as was calculated during the preliminary divorce proceedings. I was utterly fascinated. I had been so conditioned to answer his hate with love, and then more love and understanding, playing the depersonalized, impartial witness to the abuse, that it literally drove him to want to kill me. He left for work in the morning, and my son and I were not there when he returned. Lucky for him, he did not deign to appear at our court hearing to determine the implications of his many abuses on his ability to be a suitable parent. Scared as he was that the evidentiary support would reveal the true nature of his character and be documented, etched in stone by the court stenographer. Traumatic cycles are tragic and tedious, like flogging a dead horse so hard and fast that it gives the perception of reanimation, and the need to flog it once more due to delusion and a lack of self-restraint. After much time spent on the receiving end of abuse, the dedication to the perceived inescapability of it all becomes amusing once more and almost fascinating, fueling me to endure more of it, both riding the train and watching it wreck from a safe distance at the same time. Deep dysfunctional derealization and depersonalization. How much could she and I endure? Could we rationalize or ignore it? Could we prostrate ourselves in front of the monster in devotion and humble it with our love? Was it worth dying over to show the world his true nature? There was no love here, only his mirroring me back to myself, making me feel seen and understood for once in my life, only she was not me. How could she be when I, the real I, was being so horribly abused, annihilated, and nearly obliterated to the point of extinction? My son is all that makes sense to me of that time in my life, and his father's passing his genetic material to me was only a continuation of a predestined path that I believe I was already on, a wheel already in motion. Although not a student or possessing much knowledge in occult practices, the night of my ex-husband's birthday, the night my son was conceived, I called him in unwittingly, reciting aloud a spell from an occult book meant to attract your coven, including one you make yourself by way of family. I had ingested more than a few psychedelic substances, and in a waking dream, beneath a thorn bush on a coastal path of Cornwall, where I lay in a state of semi-conscious awe, my son came to me asking to be born. I picked myself up and slipped past the gaggle of drunken lads and into something more comfortable and appropriate in the form of a bed. I laid my head down to sleep, all but praying to the Lord my soul to keep. For many years afterward, what followed felt like a God-forsaken moment. But what I realized now was an act of divine will disguised as tragic irony. My sleep that night was disturbed by a crushing weight on my unconscious form, and the deafening sound of our bed banging into the wall behind the headboard. An inception, an incubus, a prophecy fulfilled, a cycle repeated. I tried to disassociate from the violent act I felt I had agreed to when marrying this man, like an unspoken wedding vow of violence. With his villain origin story vivid in my mind, I quietly submitted, martyring myself to the monster of uncontended intergenerational trauma. I tell myself that if it had not been that particular penis that presented the sperm to me antagonistically, perhaps it would have been another's, and therefore another's unhealed hungry wounds would have satiated their appetite at my most sacred site. The result would have been the same. My child, That child would have made himself known to me and be just as ready to live his life with me, and me alone. Still to this day, hindsight does not offer me the particular clarity of knowing whether or not I would have still engaged in this particular relationship, knowing what I know now. Surviving narcissistic abuse was a vital life lesson which I know in my heart of hearts that any other relationship would have given birth to, much like with my son. I It is still a circumstance that I would like to renegotiate with God for the next life, if I am so unlucky as to have one. Perhaps we skip the nuptials altogether, eh? I had been in much, much longer relationships without feeling the pull of matrimony, but my father was still alive then. I would not be so disrespectful, disillusioned, or delusional as to blame my father for his own death, but I do think someone up there owes me an apology, an explanation, or a purpose for all the pain in this lifetime. My parents were married for 45 years after only having known each other for 6 months before getting married and having a child just a few months later. Do the math. Even though their relationship was not without a certain toxicity, there was a lot of love between them. They honored their relationship and the vows between them. I was honoring my biological clock, a proverbial ticking time bomb, considering the outcome of leaning into it and honoring the call of a biological imperative. It mattered not to me that I had met this man on a dating website geared for instant intimacy and fast fucks. For me, it was a folly. I definitely did not fathom that anyone would bother to lie on a dating website. What would be the point? Why would anyone pretend to be something they are not for a night of passion, and to voluntarily enter into matrimony with that same pretense? Or at least, why would anyone lie all the way to the altar? Lie till death do us part? Lie forever? It just added to my cognitive dissonance, unraveling my ex husband's inescapably pointless labyrinth of lies. At some point, he must have known this house of cards would collapse, leveling us all to ground zero in his act of marital terrorism, but not before throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Then there was conditioning toward codependency. Even my recount of my relationship with this terrorist rings hollow. I cannot add lavish language or anecdotes. I need to get in and get out. I lingered too long in that relationship, and to do so voluntarily here in the writing is not a mode of healing. It is an attempt to find some redemptive value in that experience where there is very little, except for my son. I can only hope that any reader who has made sense of this recounting can wade through the dissociative dialogue and diatribe to find the nuggets of greater truth, see and understand through my ex the depths of human depravity, and through me some small will to endure. As with most narcissistic relationships, it was not all bad, but I refuse to confuse the reader with his rare superficial niceties and attempts to assuage my person after one of his assaults, outrage, or savagery. He was a byproduct of the ashes that I carried with me. He was the crystalline representation of the depths of unhealed parts of a satanic self, and with each toss of my dad's ashes when I was with him, I would imagine that those ashes were aspects of my dad that were mirrored in my husband, aspects of his relationship with my mother that wanted to release and forget. My ritual in those days took on a new depth of meaning. I wanted it to be that easy. A whispered intent released to the wind with my father's particulate remains. Then the magic of changed behavior. A prayer answered. I am sure tales of good and bad will make appearances or will be referenced to in this writing, directly or in subtext. But for the moment, I find that I am frustrated and bored of this man in all realms and dimensions in which we coexist. So, with these words, I hope to untie the knot in my stomach that has remained long after my divorce, one of disgust and deep regret. I cut all cords etheric and otherwise. I disengage from all enemies, foreign and domestic read, external enemies as well as internal ones, and I banish this Jabberwocky to the elsewhere.